Good afternoon, class. Again, my apologies for the issues with technology in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to record this lecture and post it for you so you can access it at your leisure and have it for you to study for the exam. What I want to talk about today is the concept of American empire. And this is sort of an uncomfortable topic. We don't like to think at times, or at least in the past, we haven't liked thinking of the concept of America having an empire, but in the late 19th century, in the wake of our successful feelings, our feelings of maturity after the Civil War, the growth of the Industrial Revolution, we start seeing a push by people in American politics to enter the global stage, that America is no longer a young nation, a childish nation. We need to take our place amongst the nations of the world, our rightful place as having interactions with the globe for any number of purposes, military, commerce, etc. So what I want to talk about today is what led to the rise of American imperialism, where did America seek to expand its power, how it utilized that power, and I want to talk about a concept that historians have come to call the white man's burden. All right, so obviously we've talked about the growth of the Second Industrial Revolution in the wake of the Civil War, and how fast the American economy expanded. Manufactured goods created in the United States are now just as good as those that had previously been imported from Europe. We have agricultural goods feeding England and Europe. They're relying upon us to meet their nutritional needs. So we're already reaching out to certain overseas markets, but those markets are rather limited on some level. We need new markets for American goods. You can only sell so many goods, so many products to the captive populace you have in your country. If you want your economy to expand, if you want your businesses to continue succeeding, then you need to find new markets for them, and increasingly we're going to look overseas for those markets. We also need new resources to keep our industries going. The best two examples of goods that we can't really produce in large quantities in the late 19th century are sugar and rubber. Yes, we have the ability to raise sugar in Louisiana and the American Gulf Coast, but if we want to capitalize or corner would be a better term. If we want to corner the sugar market, we need to control other places where sugar is grown and processed in order that we can profit from those, as well as have cheap sugar available to us for the creation of food, candy, beverages, fuels, etc. Same thing goes for rubber. We don't have any place in the continental United States where we can grow rubber, we can grow and raise rubber producing plants. And with the rise of new technologies and new styles of engines, we need more and more rubber, especially for tires for vehicles, for hoses and tubing, and any number of sources that leather used to take the place of, but now we need a new material that works better than leather. We also want to keep up with the Joneses. Essentially, obviously, if you remember, we are the former colonies of Great Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Sweden. Here in the United States, they had branched out to try and capitalize and corner the production of resources and create captive markets in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. We had shaken that off, where we were obviously no longer colonies. But in the late 19th century, Western Europe is again expanding and looking for more colonial assets that they can control for the creation and production of raw materials, as well as creating a market for their finished goods uh, because of need, want, desire, etc. In the 1880s, this is also being fueled by the belief that there is, it's fueled by the belief that whites are superior. We talked about scientific Darwinism, social Darwinism last time in class. Building off of those beliefs, we start seeing international foreign policy based on the concept that Europeans and all European descended peoples are genetically superior to Africans or Asians or anybody else around the world. So when we go out into these areas, even long settled areas like places in China that have had that had been populated for thousands of years, we're going to say, well, we're bringing you the proper culture that is European in its origins, because we know that everybody wants to be European. We know that everybody wants to be Christian. We know you secretly want to live like us, to have our goods, to worship our God. And so we're going to bring that to you. Europe is looking to competitively expand their markets, and we're looking to keep up with that asset as well. We also have a situation arising where, as trade expands and we see new colonies develop overseas, we have an increase in military spending based on protecting national business interests around the globe. In the late 19th century, this is especially going to lead to a naval buildup. Prior to the airplane, the naval vessel, the battleship, is perhaps the most important means of making war that a nation can possess. In the age before flight, naval vessels are your only way to access foreign ports and foreign lands. So you need naval vessels in order to protect commercial fleets, to hunt down pirates, to possibly intimidate colonial states that don't want to buy your goods. We also need coaling stations. We need naval bases around the world in order to support that naval buildup. We're still burning coal to drive these great ships, and as such, we need places around the world where naval vessels or American naval vessels can pull into port and refuel. Yes, you could do that in a civilian port, but it's much more secure to have American or whatever nationality you are, naval stations that you control. They're safe harbors, they're defended, that you can pull into to resupply, especially in times of war or times of military action. Great example of this is the base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. That is a coaling station. It starts as a coaling station that the American Navy will establish at the end of the 19th century. And the same goes with Guam in the wake of the Spanish-American War, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So what's this concept called the white man's burden? Essentially, the white man's burden is social Darwinism applied at an international level. The term comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem that we will discuss shortly. It's essentially the concept that since Europeans or Anglo-Saxons, white people have a better culture, have a better heritage in their own minds, they bear the burden of helping lesser cultures, lesser societies, to elevate themselves to their proper European copied lifestyles. We see this in the renewed effort to send out Christian missionaries throughout Africa and Asia. We see this in the quote-unquote spread of quote-unquote superior Western culture. Essentially what we're doing with this colonialization, this white man's burden, is trying to westernize the entire world. We even see this spread so far as soap ads. This is an ad for Pear's soap that ran in a magazine. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And we have obviously the main picture is an American military officer washing his hands using Pear's soap, because that's obviously the cleanest soap there is. But if you look closely at the images surrounding him in the lower right-hand corner, we have an American missionary, a religious figure, dealing with a kneeling African or Aborigine from some continent. He's handing him soap. He's teaching him to be clean. If you are clean, you'll stop spreading germs. Germ theory is new at this time period. If you're clean, you'll live a better lifestyle. You'll be superior to the filthy masses. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. It is the soap of civilization. So here's Kipling's poem. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor us slowly toward the light. Why brought he us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Rudyard Kipling is an Englishman who was the son of a British civil servant and his wife who was living in India. He was born in the mid-19th century. You may be familiar with The Jungle Book, which Kipling also wrote. He wrote Gunga Din. He was a very prolific author, poet, and journalist. Some people view or interpret a lot of white supremacy in the poem that I just read you. We're sending out our sons to the far edges of the continent for people who don't care for the culture we bring. These half devil and half child savages who don't understand that we're just trying to give them the best. We're bringing them toward the light. There are other people, and I myself am one of them, that wonder if this is not a critique of colonial culture and the lives that Kipling saw snuffed out in the name of colonization for Great Britain. If you wish to advance in this culture, you need a civil service position. To get a civil service position, you're going to go serve the empire in its colonies. You're going to take England's best sons and exile them to places where they are not wanted, to places where they will deal with people that don't want them there, people that oppose everything they're doing. You're sending out your sons to try and the nation declares that they're trying to develop peace for these people, but you have to fight wars of conquest in order to bring about the peace. You're working to eliminate famine and disease and bad administration or local missteps are going to eliminate all of your work. You're going to die trying to bring culture to the world. Your sons are going to far places in the world to die as they try to do the work of the empire. So there's a couple of ways to interpret this poem, but this is where we get that concept of the white man's burden. The white man's burden is still something we quote when we talk about American imperialism. Essentially, America is going to go about annexing or supporting revolutions through military means in order to get territories. Generally, there's going to be no opposition or very little opposition to this form of imperialism. Again, this is America taking its place on the global stage. It's our right to do this. It's our place in the world to do this. So we're not going to see any major opposition to these wars of expansion until we find conflict within the interpretation of why we're doing this. A lot of these conflicts are going to be spurred on by yellow journalism. War sells papers, and newspapers aren't afraid of selling a war or telling lies about a potential war or a people to go to war with in the name of selling more papers. William Randolph Hearst will famously help drum up support for the the Spanish-American War in Cuba, the invasion of Cuba, through his newspaper and the spreading of falsehoods and half-truths in his materials. Very often we'll see this yellow journalism create a body of popular opinion which pushes government action overseas. We're going to get so rallied up over the supposed rape of Cuba that we're going to see people writing letters to the president. Why aren't we going to the defense of these people in our own hemisphere? These people we've promised under the Monroe Doctrine as a means of protecting. Why aren't we stepping in? And so we'll see a push to go to war. Ultimately, American expansion in the late 19th and early 20th century is based on economic interests. We will fight 2 wars based on economic interest, and we will invade nations in the name of our economic interests. So, first one, we're going to annex Hawaii. The Sandwich Islands had essentially been a unified government over all of the islands since the late 1790s, controlled by a Hawaiian royal family. Captain Cook will have explored the South Pacific. He's the first European to have major contact with the Hawaiians. Ultimately, people will realize that Hawaii is a bountiful agricultural environment for items such as pineapple and sugarcane. Pineapple will be introduced to the Hawaiian Islands by American businessmen. And so we will see Americans slowly move over to Hawaii in order to run ranches, to raise sugar, to raise pineapple, to raise goods in a tropical climate that they can sell back in the United States. And as such, as more and more Americans and American businesses are located in Hawaii, Hawaii will have a free trade status with the U.S. until the 1890s. 1891 will come along. We're going to place a tax on imported sugar to help protect American sugar producers. This is going to create financial hard times in the Hawaiian Islands, which will eventually lead to a revolt by Americans living in Hawaii, running the sugar businesses, wondering why they're losing money, against the Queen of Hawaii. And the Americans will send in the Marines to help depose the Hawaiian Queen, At first, the American government will refuse to recognize the coup, and they will recall the Marines. This is essentially the Americans looking at this going, you guys are having an illegal revolution here. We're not going to support this. Eventually, we'll see another coup take place. The Americans in Hawaii will overthrow the government and declare their own republic. And that republic will be recognized as a territory of the United States in 1899. Cuba and the Philippines stand out as the most famous imperial wars of the late 19th century for Americans. Cuba and the Philippines, some minor islands in the South Pacific, were essentially the last remnants of the Spanish Empire. That empire that once had covered the Philippines, the Pacific, South America. Essentially, the Spanish Empire was the first empire that the sun never set upon. It was that expansive. It was global. Starting with the discovery of America by Columbus in the 1490s, that had spread out in search of gold and gems and spices and resources. The Spanish crown bankrupted itself only 200 years in to the global exploration, the age of exploration, and as such, they had lost bits and pieces of the empire ever since the 1680s, 1690s. In 1895, there will be a rebellion in Cuba against Spanish rule. There are a group of Cubans who want to have democratic home rule. They want to rule their own nation. It will be put down by Spanish authorities. However, the American press will begin to exaggerate how the Spanish government puts down the revolution, the rebellion. Here we have a newspaper illustration drawn by, if you look at it, Frederick Remington, the famous Western illustrator, of how Spanish officials had stopped an American vessel at sea on the way to Cuba and had strip searched American women on board the vessel to see if they were smuggling goods to help the Spanish rebels, including smuggling goods in their clothing. This is an outrage in late 19th century culture. You don't do this to women. This is horrific. And this is just one example of the way the American press sold the concept of a cruel Spanish master massacring and raping the innocent Cuban civilians under their rule. We also have American business interests who had invested heavily in sugarcane production in Cuba, worried about the stability and safety of their investments. So we have a combination of business interests who are worried that the Spanish might crack down on who can own or control business investment in Cuban territories. We have worry that we have an American press who is drumming up popular sentiment against the horrific Spanish conquistador of the late 19th century. We have a very worked up public. It's not going to take much to have America go to war in the name of Cuba. I'm going to call that the first half of the lecture. I have a limited amount of data that I can tape at one time. So I will be back with the second half of lecture when you click the next link. Thanks.